World Regions Geography 110, Latin America and the Caribbean, Part 5. We're going to talk about cultural practices, social differences, and identity, music, art, and film. A lot of Mexican music we see in California, a lot of films coming out of Latin America. What we don't think about is prizes for literature and art, Nobel Prizes, and other recognition. You may have heard of Frida Kahlo, a very famous painter from Mexico in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Communist, but very interesting paintings. If you've ever looked at her painting, reggae music, most of you are familiar with that. Various type of dancing. I mean, you may think of salsa, but there's a lot of other dances that also come out of Latin America, samba, tango, lots of different types of dances that blend not only indigenous, Spanish, but also black cultures. Food, lots of different types of food, spicy food, other types of food. Sport, in Major League Baseball, you see a lot of Caribbean and Latin American players. Football, that's the soccer version. And here's a picture, of course, of Usain Bolt, track, which is my favorite sport. You see a lot out of the Caribbean, not so much out of Latin America, some out of Brazil. So some great track athletes out of Brazil, but not a lot for other countries in Latin America. Gender relations, we're talking about a couple of practices or cultural manifestations, which are machismo and marianismo. Machismo is the belief that, it's the Latin masculine belief that men should have lots of kids, should be dominant in their family, should control everything, should tell the women what to do, and of course the women should go ahead and go along with that program. And I don't know how much it works anymore in the world, but it probably wouldn't in my family. Marianismo, which is that belief that women are like reflect the Virgin Mary. They're chaste, they're sweet, they're innocent, they don't say anything, they do what their husband tells them. Haven't seen too much of that either, but though you do see it in older people and in some regions in Latin America. Institutional biases against women. This is something that is not restricted to Latin America, but this chart here is of institutional gender gaps in Latin America. You see the overall gender gap right here. This is the labor force participation, female to male ratio. And here you see wage inequality, female to male ratio. And here you see women in parliament, female to male ratio. And interestingly there, the communist country is the most, where women have the most representation of anywhere else. Though in labor force participation and overall gender gap, they're about the same. It's just kind of an interesting little factoid. Racial mixing, mestizo. Mestizo is that population that is mixed with Spanish and native blood. The mulatto is the Spanish and black mix, and the Zambo is the black and native mix. We don't really think of these in the United States, these categories, racial mixing categories, but they're very prevalent in, depending on which region in Latin America that you're in, you'll see more or less of these. Maroon communities were communities. It's a general term used to describe communities of escaped slaves. So you had a region in Brazil that for about 50 or 60 years, a community and a country formed by escaped slaves from Brazil that existed for about 50 years. You have Jamaica, groups moving into the mountains in Jamaica, escaped slaves. These were part of the Maroon communities. Demography and urbanization. So you have rapid population growth throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. They're clustered in colonial ports and cities. So what you see in Latin America are large, huge cities: Mexico City, Rio, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Santiago. Big cities with huge populations, and in the periphery of those, on the outskirts of these, you have, like in Brazil, they're called favelas, but they're basically shanty towns where actually probably a good portion of the population lives. Now, what we have here, these are population pyramids. This is Paraguay's, and this is Brazil's. The thing, when you look at this, what you see is this even distribution here, which is normal, and then it drops off right here. It actually curves in a little bit, and then it's starting to come in at the base. And what that means is this population right in here, this is your prime childbearing. So you're going to have a population increase unless these people have very few children. But this is beginning to turn, and what it means is the population of the country is beginning to age. As these age groups here, like 15 of these tranches, move up, of course some will die, but if this continues in this trend, it will get narrower at the bottom. And that has long-term consequences economically and politically for the country, because as these people age, you will have fewer and fewer people, new people coming into the workforce who will not be able to financially support the large bubble. In the United States, you have the same problem. We don't have quite the pyramid like this. Ours is still expanding a little bit at the bottom. It's because our population is growing in the country. The other part of this that's bad is, as you have this population bubble decreasing, then the population begins to shift down, and the population begins to shrink, which means the economy shrinks. And so it has long-term economic consequences. Now, Paraguay here, you see goes quite a bit farther to its broadest point, but then it's coming back much more dramatically, which means that the population is going to have a dramatic drop. And as these age, once this group here gets up into this region, you're going to have a lot fewer people to support that population, and again has long-term impacts for the economy and for the country politically and economically. So migration from the region. Migration within the region is primarily rural to urban, which is pretty common throughout the world. If you think about the United States, people move from small towns to bigger cities. They move from the rural to the urban. You have push-pull factors. The push factor is there's no jobs in the rural areas. And if there are jobs, they're in agriculture and they don't pay very well. And so people move to the city because they feel like there's more opportunity. There's been a number of diasporas. Diasporas are relocated populations, and so you have this mass migration to a country of people, but they kind of keep their identity, and that's what where the diaspora comes in. Braceros, some of you may or may not be familiar with this term. Um, it's from brazos, arms in Spanish, and it was a term used to import labor, manual labor, low-income manual labor, primarily beginning of World War II. Men went into the army, the military. The U.S. needed labor. They negotiated a treaty with Mexico for work permits, and that treaty was uh, repassed and with some minor changes all the way up until 1965 when the U.S. redid the immigration laws and eliminated the Bracero program. But the Bracero program had been an ongoing program um, up until 1965. The Bracero program, a lot of people that came here, mostly men, would come work for a period of time, 9 months, then go back to Mexico. Um, they would take money with them. They would send money to support their families. That money they send is called remittances. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Remittances are a key point. It's the number one source of foreign revenue in the Mexican economy. And in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's the number one source of foreign revenue. Migration from the region to the U.S. has dropped off significantly since 2005 because of the economic downturn. And I think it's also a little bit reflective of more of a balancing of economic opportunities in those developing regions. Now, this is a picture of kind of where migration is going. So you see out of like Central America coming up here into Mexico and then into the U.S. From the U.S. back to Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, many returns out of the Caribbean into Florida, Cuba into Florida, Caribbean into Florida, into Cuba, and then up. So there's a lot of migration this direction. Within Latin America, a lot of it into Brazil, Venezuela, not so much anymore because the economy is so bad. But you're seeing a movement into Argentina and Chile out of Peru, and that's because the economies are better there. Paraguay, Uruguay there. There's some migration to Europe from the Caribbean, particularly in English speaking, and also from Ecuador into Spain. So you just kind of look it over and review this map. Highly urbanized region. This is Rio. Mega cities, some of the largest cities in the world. Urban primacy, which all that means is that the dominant place where people live in Latin America are big urban environments. And with those urban environments come lots of social and environmental problems. If you watch the Olympics, you saw plenty of pollution. I mean, they couldn't even allow some of the boating events to happen. The water was so polluted. And then you have the favelas, which is the Portuguese term, but it's basically this right here. You have a picture of Rio here, and this is the favela up above it. This is where all the money is and the wealthy people, and this is the poor people who are throwing together little shacks. Last is the future geographies, sustainable development. That's something that Latin America is moving towards. Public attitudes, manage resources, demands, and reduce pollution. Emerging economies. Brazil is an emerging economy, but its economy has really gone south in the last, and more diversified, wealthier economies. Democracy and public attitudes are better, and reduce corruption and crime. That's a big problem facing Latin America.